Hello, everybody. I am starting a couple of minutes early, as I have learned, just to make sure that YouTube doesn't do something demonic. Still don't like the lighting, but that's fine. I feel like I look very hazy. I don't like that. But thank you for joining us here at the Film Strip to talk about Never Been Kissed. And oh boy, we have a lot to talk about. Do we have a lot to talk about today? As you might have noticed, I didn't do a video this week, so thank you for being flexible. I did want to cover a couple of things maybe in the discussion, so this might be a little longer than usual, because I did want to do some sort of framework, or any sort of background for the movie at all, because I know that this movie is so much. It's a lot. And I am hoping that you guys get something out of this, and I'm sure that people have reactions to it. Let me just make sure. Great. But first of all, there are a lot of things going on. This movie was made in 1999, which is the same year as She's All That, if you've heard of that one. That's a very classic 90s movie, and the same year as 10 Things I Hate About You, which is completely different in tone. It always strikes me as very weird that they're made in the same year. But all three of those are very representative of 1999, particularly, and of the 90s when we think of 90s teen rom-coms, which is interesting because it's so late in the decade. I think part of that is that the first half of the 90s were sort of dedicated to late 80s type of thing, not Dazed and Confused itself, because that's more modern, but those types of movies like American Graffiti. And then Clueless really changed a lot of what 90s rom-coms was, so what they were about, and the style and the substance of them. And it really spurred on a bunch of different things. One of them was Clueless was based on Emma, and in the 90s, not just in rom-coms, or not just in teen comedies, across the board, there was a sort of Shakespeare renaissance in the 90s. Shakespeare has always been popular, but there was a large push to modernize Shakespeare in a way. There was the new Hamlet in 1994, I believe. There was the Othello, which was and that's why you also have strains of that popping up in Never Been Kissed, because a way that rom-coms were trying to sort of legitimize their standing and make it more literary, a way to make it seem like it had more substance, or have value to culture, is by making it an update of a Shakespeare play, and that kind of works in different ways. I think it worked for Clueless, which is Jane Austen, not Shakespeare, but it was a classic piece of literature. So I think it works with Clueless, and I think it works with 10 Things I Hate About You. There was also She's the Man in the early aughts, that a lot of people love, even though it's not my favorite. And there's Get Over It, which is Midsummer Night's Dream, which I have a lot of love for, even though it's very flawed. But there was a whole host of movies that were just rework Shakespeare for modern times. Apparently, I learned today that there was a Richard III, I think, in 1995 with Jason Isaacs. And I'm probably going to check that out sometime soon. But that's kind of where the whole literary side of Never Been Kissed is coming from, because they use Much Ado About Nothing as sort of a metaphor for where Josie is coming from. And it's also part of this push of the 90s to be very self-referential and self-aware, very steeped in culture in a way that other movies weren't necessarily. So it's sort of playing around with, you kind of get the joke if you understand culture or if you've done some reading. The whole scene at the prom is a lot of references to other movies and pop culture at the time, so you sort of get these background visual jokes. You are right, it is as you like it, and I don't know my Shakespeare. So I guess it started with Kiss Me Kate. but yeah, so they're talking about Rosalind, I don't know. But that was like they were doing As You Like It, and another movie did Much Ado About Nothing, I think. But the what was I trying to say? So that was a huge 90s thing, and the awareness of pop culture, it kind of comes in at the very beginning of the movie, because she's talking about, like, how in movies there's that dream, and then like they never tell you it's a dream. This isn't a dream, which is sort of supposed to make the audience aware. The audience is supposed to be aware of certain things, or it's supposed to be speaking to the audience as part of the audience, which I think ended up being a Friends thing, because started mostly as a Friends thing, because Friends really played with those sort of tropes. They'd have the characters sitting around watching telenovelas, and there was this sort of sense permeating the movie of like being culturally literate, and those who are culturally literate sort of get more out of the movie, or like have more value, or something of that sort. So that's sort of where that part of the 90s came from. And then the other half of the 90s that I wanted to talk about, that definitely shows its face in this movie, is this there was a huge push of like grossed out humor or embarrassment humor. Sort of it was sort of like meanness to its characters, because the characters would be unaware of like how weird or how unnatural they were being. And this is throughout like a lot of different movies. This is in like Dumb and Dumber. This was in a lot of Jim Carrey movies. It was sort of, the more you could commit to being unaware of your surroundings, not unaware, but it was inappropriate, I guess. There was a huge, like, there's a big movie was There's Something About Mary, which is all gross out humor, and like characters sort of not being embarrassing themselves through being painfully sincere, I guess. So it's sort of like sincerity as a punishment. And I think that is sort of why people think of like maybe the 90s as a bit more cynical. This movie, I don't think, is necessarily the Josie isn't a cynical character. And we're supposed to sort of relate to her on that level. I think we're supposed to root for her not being cynical. And that like love still exists in some way. But I don't know that that works. But also that there's a whole thing of like knowing, this is why I shoot the videos. It's a cynical sense that if you open yourself up for this earnesty, that like the world will just like shut you down in a sense. It's sort of like being this earnest. You can't survive the world, going through the world being this earnest, and that kind of comes through in a lot of things, or that you can, but like it's just uncomfortable to watch, I guess. So you're sort of supposed to root for the earnestness and also know better at the same time. So like that awfully painful scene, like the worst scene where she's reading the poem to Billy, you're kind of supposed to, I think the idea was you sympathize with her struggle, and you like sort of feel for her because she's being very open with her feelings. But it's also so painful to watch because we like know better, or because everyone else in the room knows better. And so all the other characters, and also sort of the movie, is being mean to her for being this genuine person. And I think that's a big push in the movie too. I think this movie is very representative of that sort of viewpoint towards its more earnest or heartfelt characters. So I chose this movie not because it's my favorite movie. I think it's the second time I watched it, because I just watched it again, it was a lot easier to get through because I was watching it with friends. But it is, I think, really representative of a specific time in rom-coms, and it brings up a lot of questions of what we were sort of thinking then, what sort of why we consider these movies rom-coms, and how it differs from the rom-coms that we watched previously, and like why this movie is what people think about when they think about rom-coms, especially for people around my age. Like everyone I know saw this movie, and people have watched this movie over and over and over again, and so it's in the pop culture. And this is the sort of movie that people think about when we think about rom-coms. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, but how has that changed from the other rom-coms that I would say do count as rom-coms? How is that different from this movie, which people also call a rom-com? And like, how did that shift happen? What are like the strengths and weaknesses of both things? Because I do think there are strengths and weaknesses of both. One of the things I did want to bring up specifically with this week is this obsession with youth and being young and being cool. And I think the 90s had a lot of that. This idea that being sort of hip or popular, this movie is obsessed with being popular, and I don't understand why, because no one I know, having actually been to high school, unlike any writer of this movie or any creative force behind this movie, having actually been to high school, it is nothing like this. I have so many questions about the people at this school because every guy is a sexual predator. Every person in the school is kind of a psychopath. No one cares this much about no one cares this much about the nerd. No one gets bullied this much. These people are like unconscionably cruel to other people. And it's made to look like this is across decades. Like this is just the high school experience, that if you aren't popular, that you get picked on, and that the popular kids care about you and know your name, which was not my experience at all. There's just so much happening in this film. Another thing that I did want to bring up really briefly is I think one of the reasons that bullying is a theme in this movie might have just, and you kind of see little references to this, although they're kind of obscure or oblique, is that Columbine happened in 1994 and this is 1995. So the way that a lot of films were, a lot of media was dealing with like 9/11 in the years directly after 9/11, teen movies of this era, and also shows, but like a lot of teen movies, even though they're rom-coms or comedies, they're also directly dealing with these of like, what are high schoolers doing? Are they bullying each other? Like, how cruel are high schoolers really? Because at the time people thought, oh, it's because these guys were getting bullied that they did that. And so that is sort of, even that's not really a question that the movie is bringing up, but it's something that it portrays as like the high school experience because sort of like the idea of what high school at that time. It was just like in the public consciousness in that way. And like there, even like in the first 5 minutes, or 20 minutes or whatever, like the car backfiring, her car backfires, spooks everyone out. And I feel like that's probably a Columbine thing. And then they had like the security going into the school, which I don't have anymore. I'm sure that some places have that, but I don't think that they would have that in South Bend, Illinois anymore, but correct me if I'm wrong. So those are sort of just like little references to let you know, or it let me know that like this is what a lot of media was thinking about at that time. And that's maybe one of the other reasons why high schoolers were like so on the mind in the 90s for various reasons. Like, what is going on with high schoolers? What is happening at school? We have no idea. So I think that lays a lot of the framework for the film itself. I did talk about the gross out comedy. And I never said it was a good movie. So someone's asking, how is this a good movie? The plot is preposterous. I didn't say it was a good movie. I said it was a representative movie. So I think I think a lot of people have a lot of love for this movie because it's peak sort of 90s schmaltz, in the sense that people who grew up with 90s rom-coms, it's a specific formula and a specific era that they are somewhat nostalgic for. Or if you're or if you're like into 90s rom-coms, you don't necessarily have to have grown up at that time, but like you enjoy, if like the way that I'm like nostalgic for like 80s things, even though I wasn't around in the 80s, I still think like Back to the Future is the best thing ever. So I do I do think it's a very representative movie of the time, which is why we're looking at it. It is it does have it does qualify as like one of the 90s rom-coms. Okay. And I also one of the things I didn't fully mention was that there is like this idea of authentic teenage experiences, which I did kind of cover a little bit in like what's going on at schools. But I think one of the other effects of Clueless was that there's this really they're trying to get this insight into like the language of teenagers, the way that they talk, the way that they dress. There's sort of like this making fun of like ditzy or Valley Girl type characters. Although like the thing about Clueless is that the whole point of the movie is that it sort of redeems these characters in a way that like, oh no, these guys aren't these guys come off as terrible, but they actually have a lot of depth to them and they're capable of good. Whereas this movie is kind of just mean. And it doesn't really redeem the Valley Girl characters in any way, except that at the end, she waxes poetic about all these characters who were mean and horrible to her. And it's supposed to be sort of like nostalgic about high school, like as the best years of your lives, or like as some sort of like moment in time where like things are, I don't know, aspirational. And yet we didn't really see any of that in the movie. I don't find any redemption for the Mean Girls at all. I think maybe one or two of them say funny lines, but like I don't think they're as funny as the movie seems to think they are. And they're just mean. And they care way too much about Josie and her friend. They like go out of their way to like bully them for like no reason. So I think one of the questions I did have was what is supposedly the moral of this movie? So the idea is to be yourself, although I'm not sure how well that's communicated in the film itself. Josie says that she has found she winds up finding herself, but I'm unclear on who that self is. And she does have one of the more fleshed out characters in the story, which is kind of saying something. At the beginning of the movie, it sort of builds this idea of Josie as a control freak who loves order and can't stand chaos and can't really take life confidently. But then it doesn't really go any further than that. She has a sort of crisis, but that's only because she goes to defend her friend. But it never really, I feel like she never really confronts herself. She confronts her past self, but we never really see her gain confidence in the way that you might expect her to. So I feel like we never really get to see her be herself because she's too busy flirting with her English teacher. The other question, which I think is maybe like one of the big ones, is how does this movie compare to the previous rom-coms that we've seen? So I think this is me going on a rant, and I apologize. I didn't get my discussion in earlier, or I didn't get my video in earlier, so I have a lot to talk about. But you like, obviously feel free to comment. But for me, how I feel about this film is that there's less of a negotiation or battle of the sexes in this film. So the relationship between Josie and her teacher, it's dramatic because it's not supposed to be allowed. Um, we are talking about what about the pedophilic English teacher? We are talking about the pedophilic English teacher right now. So everyone in this movie is a sexual predator. There's like no way of getting around it. It's all awful. It's all terrible. I guess it's supposed to be romantic because it's forbidden in a way. And I think that was one of the running themes of the 90s. I don't know. Like they needed a reason for them to not be together, which I think is kind of what I'm getting at, is that their relationship isn't really based on any sort of negotiation or working out of their personalities. There's no clash of personalities in this, because to me, the English teacher is kind of just like non-existent as a character, aside from being smitten with Josie and not being able to hit on his 18-year-old student, which is a real internal struggle. It's not the only unlawful relationship, because her brother tries to hook up with the 16-year-old gymnast, although he never he knows better than to sleep with her, but he does go to prom with her. And also Josie goes to prom with the senior kid, and she definitely has a crush on him. So it's like three awful, inappropriate relationships in one movie. So the point I was trying to make was they don't really have any. They have a rapport, but the problem of the film is an external force. So there's nothing internal to them that they're working out, which I think makes me feel less connected to the final result. In the sense that when we watch The Awful Truth, it's things are happening externally, but what's really happening is this conflict between the characters, between what they want and each other, and how they feel about each other, and so they're sort of battling it out either verbally or through fistfights in the other room. And through assumptions and things like that. But what's happening in this film is that the only reason that they're not together is because it's inappropriate. And so we never really get to see how the characters complement each other in any way. We don't really get to see any depth to their relationship. And I think this is pretty common for a lot of 90s movies, is that a lot of the conflict is external. There's something keeping these characters apart, instead of these characters not being able to get together for personal reasons and working that out. And I think it can be done well in the theoretical sense. I think I probably have more of a preference for the internal versus the external, but I know that there are a lot of external. So I think maybe 10 Things does this very well, in that it is an external thing that's happening, but the way that Kat and Pat, it's Kat and Patrick, right? The way that they get together is through this battle, because he has to convince her that it's worth having that discussion, or it's worth giving him a chance. And so the betrayal hits because they had found this equilibrium, and they had finally come to this peace when everything sort of gets blown up. And in this version, he was going to ask his 18-year-old, he was going to tell his 18-year-old student that he loved her or something. I don't know what he was going to say at the prom, but he asked his 18-year-old student to dance with him at the prom. So there was clearly no conflict as of that point. The conflict was that he wasn't allowed to hit on her, but not necessarily that they had to come to any mutual agreement or understanding. And I think so. There are two sides of that coin where kind of get to know the male character a little less. You understand less of his character, and so he doesn't make as much an impression. So the movie is much more about her, which I guess would make it the chick flick instead of about them. And they're both, and so both these movies are considered romantic comedies. But the awful truth is about a couple, and Never Been Kissed is about the woman. And so that shift from having two characters sort of having this interaction, and from one character having this wonderful thing happen to her and like becoming herself, it really becomes evident when you look at the history of romantic comedies, and that might be one of the reasons why people kind of consider them chick flicks now, even though we know that romantic comedies are capable of being much, much more. And there's a double-sided thing where this might limit the this might limit the genre in some way, but also there's nothing wrong with, it's one of the only genres that focuses on women. Which is, there's a dearth of it everywhere else. And I think part of that also might be that other genres that used to include women don't include them anymore, because things have become so polarized. So things are either men's genres or women's genres, and there's no there's less discussion between the two. So like action movies are for men, even though like there used to be like or gangster movies and stuff like that focus on male characters instead of like the relationship between a bunch of different characters. And I think some of that has also been the shift from there used to be a lot more sense of the communal or ensemble. Even though one person would head the cast, there would still be like a big like a general cast of characters, and it's gone from like the communal to like the personal plight and the personal hero's journey. I got way off track there, but that's how rambling goes. And then there's also this idea of, because it's for women, the male teacher is sort of this representation of like this wish fulfillment for women. So it's less important that the relationship, it takes the forefront of the film, and it's more about Josie and living that wish fulfillment of having like a sensitive, caring English teacher guy be into you when you thought you were a nerd. So nerds can get the guy, is the idea, even though, guys don't make passes at girls who wear glasses or whatever that is. So some of that is, I wouldn't say necessarily that a teacher who is hitting on his student is wish fulfillment, but that's sort of where the idea of the non-male character comes from. And there are positives and negatives to that too. So I think a positive is that like sometimes, women deserve more attention, or sometimes women just want to live in a world where this fantasy relationship can exist, and it's fine, and it's a fairy tale, and that's totally okay. I do think that it also sometimes detracts from it sometimes detracts from more interesting examinations of relationships in a positive setting, because I know that dramas do examinations of relationships all the time, but it's always about abuse and torture and stuff like that. And I think there can be multiple perspectives on that. All right, so there was that rant. So I did think I did ask why we think maybe rom-coms are chick flicks now. I did kind of cover that. And I did ask on my notes, is this movie to blame? I don't know that this movie is to blame. It definitely contributed to that culture, because when people think about rom-coms, they think about movies like Never Been Kissed, or they think specifically of Never Been Kissed. And I don't think it originated this idea, but it did contribute and sort of define this idea of rom-coms being chick flicks. And then there's like this weird heartfelt sentimentality that is kind of unearned in the entire movie. So I have several questions. You can see the several questions that I have. These don't necessarily relate to rom-coms, but does relate specifically to this movie. And I have so many of them, so many questions about this film. Thank you for watching this if you watched it, because it took a lot of effort for me to get through this film. So we begin. First of all, why do these high schoolers pick on all the nerds so much? Why are they so unbelievably cruel? Why do they care what the nerds are doing? Why, like, one of the things is, like, every character in this movie wants to be popular, and why is that such a prize? Even the nerdy girl. One of the things I liked about Can't Buy Me Love is that his friend was a nerd, and he just didn't care. He was just like, yeah, I don't want to be popular. It's better to not be popular. I am who I am. But every character in this movie just, like, desperately wanted to be popular. And why is such a premium placed on popularity in this movie, and why is it portrayed as something that every character wants? And I think that is also part of the sort of 90s trope of, She's All That is paying a popular guy to make over a nerdy girl so she can become popular. And there is this, like, and Can't Buy Me Love, Drive Me Crazy is and in Drive Me Crazy, it's this guy has a fake relationship with this girl and, like, becomes popular, and so that's sort of a meditation on, he's not really interested in being popular, but sort of a meditation on popularity. And, like, I think that's, like, I think it's a good movie, but it's not in the same stratosphere as Never Been Kissed is in relation to the pop culture, because everyone's seen Never Been Kissed, or at least heard of it, and not everyone has seen or heard that movie. I think that this premium on popularity is a very it seems very 90s to, like, be pushing this idea of, like, of course every person wants to be popular, and the only way to be popular is to be yourself, but popularity is ultimately what everyone wants to achieve, and I think that's very false. And I think that's the examination of popularity is much more interesting to me than everyone's needless drive to be popular, as it is in this movie. And it's just very weird that, like, all Josie wants is to be popular, when she's accepted in her crowd, and she's very happy in her crowd. So it makes literally no sense. And, like, so as one of my English teachers once said, cruelty thy name is adolescence, which is true, but at the same time, I have never seen or experienced or witnessed any sort of bullying on the level that this movie does. Like, not a single, like, it's so over the top and overdone, and not even in, like, a Hollywood movie way. It's like, these people actually think this is what high school is, and it is not. This is completely random, but this is James Franco's first role. So if you saw James Franco, good on you. I saw him. I flipped out. He's one of Guy's, like, cronies, or one of Guy's or whatever. And so that was a fun cameo, because a surprising number of people that I've heard of are in this film, and it threw me for a loop. The second thing, or third or fourth or whatever, is that this school has absolutely zero dress code, which is whatever. Like, people make fun of this. People make fun of schools having no dress code in, like, shows or whatever, but this film had zero dress code. Someone showed up to the prom as Adam and Eve in, like, fig leaf bikinis to the prom, and, like, the Barbies showing up to the, like, why would you want to show up to your prom in that outfit? I also had some bones to pick with a couple of the prom outfits. One of them I thought was actually really funny. I thought there actually was a good joke in there, in that two people decided to show up as Joseph and Mary, a pregnant Mary, which, I mean, you do you, but, like, I don't know why you'd want to go to your prom like that. And then they were like, no, there's no room at this table for you. You have to go over there," which I actually thought was a kind of clever, funny joke. And there's also there's a group showing up as the Village People, and the theme was meant for each other. So the only conclusion I can draw is that there's a whole gay polycule at the high school that no one has mentioned before, and I'm really upset that the entire movie wasn't about them. And then in the background, this is real nitpicky, but there are 2 Star Trek characters, and one of them is in a yellow shirt, so I have to assume it is Kirk. And it's definitely TOS. It's definitely original series costumes. So one of them is in yellow, and the other one is in blue. So I have to assume that the yellow is Kirk, who famously did not literally the point of the show is that he does not date a single person in the entire show, because he is like married to a ship. But my other thought was that the person in blue could be Spock. So if it's Kirk and Spock shippers showing up at the prom, 2 thumbs up. You did a great job. I love you guys. So I had a whole thing about the costumes in this movie. There was a lot to talk about. But yeah, this movie definitely throws you for a loop. There's a lot going on. It doesn't really know what it's doing a lot of the time. I feel like it kind of just like throws things out there. There are entire scenes that like don't really like tie into any sort of central plot or theme of the movie. The whole like Molly Shannon thing is funny, especially like when she's coming in to do like sex education, but that also has no bearing on the movie at all. And like another thing that was interesting, because I was talking about popularity, I know this isn't cohesive in a certain sense, but it's an interesting perspective on popularity, because the thing that makes Josie popular is someone else vying for her, of like telling all these lies about her. So the only way to get popular is to have someone lie on your behalf or something. Like she doesn't even do it herself. Like even when she's like dressing normally, like it doesn't work. It's just, this movie confounds me. This movie deeply confounds me. There's so much inappropriate in it. There's so much that it just, and like there's a whole makeover thing, and we don't even get a makeover montage. Like, what 90s movie about a nerdy girl going to cool girl doesn't have a 90s makeover montage? It's just like, it makes no sense. I was extremely mad. I was so upset at this movie. But we got through it. There's a lot of content in there, and I think it is, despite how upsetting it is, and believe me, I was very upset by this movie. There are people. One of the friends I watched it loves this movie to bits, because it was like one of the 2 movies they had at school, and it was the only one in the lounge, and they just watched it over and over and over again. And it is that sort of movie for a lot of people, the way that like I watch Singing in the Rain, or a lot of people watch Singing in the Rain when they're sick because they know it so well. I believe that Singing in the Rain maybe has a bit more content than this movie, but it hits those same sort of feelings of either like security or familiarity. So this movie does mean a lot to a lot of people, and a lot of people love this movie, and there are some scenes that are pretty good. There are a lot of scenes that are also pretty bad. There's a whole thing about like the PTSD. Like there are things in this movie that stick out. One that like a lot of people, like the thing that people remember about this movie, if they haven't seen it in 10 years, which I hadn't seen it in 10 years before this week, is the scene where she's going to prom and she gets egged, and that is traumatizing. And I think it traumatized the people in the theaters because it was so painfully awkward. And I think that's one of the things that 90s was going for, is not traumatizing people in the theaters, but having these truly like awful, horrific, or like so like painful moments, and like experiencing those moments so that everyone, like, it's like a communal painful experience, and it's something to talk about. So I think that the movie achieved what it was planning to do, and it was a fairly successful movie, I believe, and it definitely like stayed in the cultural consciousness, but it's definitely it can be a struggle to get through now. Maybe because I'm a little too close to it because it was something from when I was a kid. But I do think that it does bring up, it has a lot of content in it, and it does bring up a lot of questions specifically relevant to the history and the current state of romantic comedies. I think a lot of the comedies, or a lot of romantic comedies that we're going to see next week and possibly in the future, if I continue the series, anything past in the 2000s definitely takes these 90s comedies and tries to complicate them in the way. But the 90s comedies were so huge and so emblematic. They created this like template that really affected the way that people think about comedies in general, or romantic comedies in general. They really were not flagship, but they really like reconstrued the way that that we consider rom-coms. So hopefully with this course, you sort of understand that like this is not the way that rom-coms have always been, and there's a lot of variety in rom-coms, and they're capable of a lot of things, but you also understand why we have reached this point, and what led us to this point. I know I have been going on for 40 minutes, but if you guys have any questions or comments, I know that some comments have been floating in throughout the course of the hour. But if you guys have any last words to say before we put this movie to rest and never watch it again, I might watch it again. We'll see. There's so much. And some of it is that, like, this movie is really wrong. But, like, when you watch it with friends, it's funnier than it is because it's so awful. So it's funnier to chat about how terrible it is with someone else than it is to like watch it alone and like have to experience it that way. So maybe that was one of the points of 90s movies, is like watching things communally with your friends to tear it apart. Because that's very different from the way that like we watch media now in a binge all at once. And I assume that watching this in the theater was a very different experience. So I think if people don't have last words or last comments, we can definitely wrap it up for this week. I'm hoping next week, which is Chasing Amy, which is a Kevin Smith movie. If you haven't seen a Kevin Smith movie, he has a very particular style, but I think that this is one of his better ones. Ben Affleck is in it, along with a lot of other people like Jason Lee, who's great. It's a very sort of, it's not a weird movie. It is of like the indie 90s genre. So it's doing its own thing. It kind of exists in its own universe. And I also haven't seen it in maybe like 6 or 7 years, so I can't remember specifics yet. I will by the time that we watch it next week. It does try to sort of complicate this idea of a romantic comedy and sort of throws some wrenches in there. But I think it does a pretty good job of having that of returning to this idea of internal conflicts versus external conflicts. And it sort of grapples with modern culture in a way that a lot of other movies haven't, because it introduces a very common thing, which is queerness. And the way that it represents that maybe is problematic. We will see. It probably is, because it's the 90s. But that it even addresses it at all, I think, is like a really interesting look into romantic comedies and this traditional idea of a male and female pairing. And then you can definitely see, and then, so yeah, I was going to get ahead of myself, but I shouldn't do that. So next week is Chasing Amy. And I hope you guys can join me for that. I should have a video next week. If not, because things happen and get in the way, I will definitely continue to do the discussions every Wednesday night. So even if I don't get a video out, I will be here to talk about the movie at 8:30 as usual. But I'm hoping to get a video out. Thank you again for being flexible this week. Maybe sometime in the future, I will make some sort of video that's just a lot of me complaining about this movie, but like also more of a like framework for watching the movie. If you want to like watch that before watching this, I don't know. It's too late now. You're 44 minutes into this video. But we'll see what happens. And thank you for joining me. And I hope you have a lovely week.